Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're excited to have you all with us for this virtual office hour session with both Janet Carlson and Christine Bywater. This event is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Education and the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching here at the GSE. My name is Manaf Mansour, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations and Community Engagement at the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford University. It's a pleasure to have so many of you join us this evening. We know that many of you are facing new challenges in your classrooms and instructional spaces, and have been, and that your instructional spaces have been transformed or in some cases displaced. We hope tonight's office hours is a space where you can share your questions, problems of practice, and hopefully gain some good strategies in tackling some of those questions or problems from Christine, Janet, and perhaps from one another. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Janet and Christine. Thank you both for offering your time with us this evening.
Thanks, Manaf. We appreciate that orienting set of comments. And welcome to all of our participants. We know this is a challenging time as everyone has reorganized their lives, and for you to take the time to be part of this community right now means a lot to all of us, and I hope to the rest of the virtual participants that are out there with you. We chose our title tonight, Centering What's Important, Not Just What's Urgent, in order to help ground everybody in why we're involved in teaching and learning. So if we start with the next slide, I want to remind us when we're thinking about teaching and learning, we absolutely have to start by supporting the human beings that we're interacting with first. That's not just your students, though I would put them in a very central place. It's yourself, it's your family members, it's your friends. Entire lives have been disrupted, not just our work lives. Any of you who went through a teacher preparation program or have taken an educational psychology course can remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If people don't feel safe, learning's never going to happen. And so trying to remember it's not just about that content curriculum we're familiar with in our lives when it's quote normal. It's about making sure that those around us are safe. And this runs the whole gamut. It's not teachers taking on that whole responsibility. It's also principals and other administrators making sure their teachers feel safe and supported as whole human beings. Once we've got some safety established and hopefully sustained, then we can think about idea number 2. Christine and I are going to talk to you and encourage you to think about embracing the shift to remote learning in ways that continue to center the learners and the learning, not starting with those platforms, those apps, those gadgets, all the techie stuff at the center. We get those are necessary tools. We get that they can be frustrating. In the end, they're not the point of the remote learning. It's who's that learner and what is it that we're learning. All right, let's look at the next idea. In thinking about how to center learners and the learning, one thing to do is to prioritize the building, and I would argue in this time, rebuilding of community with your students and their families. We're not just going to suddenly plunk into a Zoom meeting like tonight and all be best friends. We've got to find out what's going on, how we're doing, what we need to do to get a sense of community. Point 4 adds a nuance to that. It's also really important to maintain a sense of community among colleagues and across your whole school site. That might be as simple as a virtual happy hour, but it also means continuing to hold staff meetings, grade level collaboration meetings. If you're like me, you're probably getting zoomed out, but I find that if I change up the space and I change up the conversations and we keep the reason that we're doing our work in the foreground, those Zoom meetings get a lot more tolerable. All right, now let's get to point 5 of keeping what's important in front of us, not just what's urgent. As you design and adapt your lessons, don't forget the fundamentals that you already know as a high quality teacher. Keep those fundamentals that emphasize creativity and collaboration in the foreground. Do that by thinking first about what do I really want my students to know? What are my goals? What are the objectives? Blend that with your student interests and assets. If you think back up to point 3 in that sense of community with your students and your families, what are they interested in right now? What are the things they can bring into the conversation and the learning? And then point C, let's leverage the affordances of technology in ways that privilege the student's voice, not fancy ways for me to give a lecture in my biology class if we were secondary, or for me to spend all the time explaining a math problem to my fourth graders. But how do we increase the student talk and the place where learning happens? So with that as a big frame, Christine's going to dive in at a different level and really think about how we bring point 5 to life.
Thanks, Janet, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all to be thinking about these things. So our team at CSET, if you'll go to the next slide, has been working to think about how can we use research-based practices to inform how we think about remote learning. And we've created a guide that's called the Technology Integration Practices Guide. That link is not clickable, but there's a QR code. If you have a mobile device, you can scan it and it will bring up that website. I also know the link will be sent to you after this webinar, but it takes you through a pathway to help you start to think about what are the ways that I can create really meaningful experiences for my students remotely, and start with a process around defining what that means, starting to plan some of the points Janet said around considering students' interests and assets, considering the community they're coming from, considering the devices they may have, and then what sort of activities or conditions can I start to think about in my lessons to support creativity, collaboration, and communication remotely. And then I think most importantly, after you've done all that, what are the questions I need to ask myself as a teacher to really think about what worked, what didn't, what students did I serve, and who got left out, so I can start to iterate and think about how I can make a better experience for my students next time. So that guide is available on our website, and we're happy to answer questions about it during this webinar. If you go to the next slide, we also have a couple other resources for you.
I wanted to point out this recent article from The Atlantic. The author interviewed teachers in San Francisco, and I think did a really nice job of two things: bringing to life what this setting that you're trying to work in as a teacher feels like and is like every day, and keeping what's important in the foreground. So many things I'm seeing published today really emphasize the urgency or describe all the crises that people are in. And while I think those are useful parts of the conversation, I'm not sure that's what we always need to move our teaching and our learning forward. So I wanted to share this Popular Press article with you. It reinforces some of the things that Christine and I are saying tonight.
And another resource for you is one of our partners over the past few weeks has become Stanford Online High School, who does online high school for about 800 students, both in the United States and abroad. And they have created a website taking their best experiences from their online classrooms to help support teachers who are now transitioning to remote learning. They also offer webinars and do Q&A. So that's also a great resource to find more detailed experiences of sample lessons and structures that you could provide for students remotely.
I really liked a lot of your comments about building and the rebuilding of community. And so a question that I have actually for the two of you is, when we think about rebuilding community, I think that can often be a kind of a more foreign concept to us, especially when we get displaced. What are some elements of rebuilding community that we should be thinking about? Are there signs of specific places or specific types of structures that we should be keeping in play when we think about rebuilding or restructuring our community?
Interestingly enough, I think one of the starting places is actually to go backwards and to some fundamentals of any time that you're starting a new friendship or building a new community, and ask the questions that when things are as expected, we don't always ask anymore. How is it going? How's your husband's job? What did you do for groceries this week? Things that aren't necessarily part of everyday conversation with people you may have worked with for some time, or families. If you've taught at a school for an extended period, you know the siblings, you know the parents, you know the cousins. back it up and ask questions in a different way that are more fundamental. And again, I find myself guided quite a bit by Maslow's hierarchy of needs in this time. And the other thing is, we can't assume my struggles during COVID-19 and shelter in place are the same as Christine's, are the same as my third grader during reading group. Christine, what do you want to add?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add too that we need to remember that just like at the beginning of the school year, the physical space that we're now teaching in is different for these students. So rebuilding that community, much like you would in the beginning of school year, checking in with their peers, how do they get to know each other? How do they check in on their emotions for themselves and for their families is really important. I would also say that that rebuilding community comes from those norms and expectations that may have existed in a physical classroom. And what does that look like and feel like for students who are remote, and particularly the ones who don't have access to devices or whose schedule has shifted because they're in a different physical place? How are we going to bring them into the community and keep them connected?
Fantastic. I see a question here. This is from Doug. We K-5 independent schools are struggling to define the appropriate balance between synchronous and asynchronous learning. Asynchronous seems better to deliver instruction, but synchronous seems better to build or rebuild community. How do you recommend finding a balance?
I'm going to throw a third permutation in there, at least based on the conversations I'm hearing. And to my knowledge, I haven't seen any research in this area. I think we're in some uncharted territory. One of the things I'm seeing elementary teachers do is set up one-on-ones or two-on-ones so that some of the synchronous time is much more connected with an individual child or two children at one time as opposed to a whole class. And that piece of synchronous can often be short, 15 minutes or less, but be very meaningful. And so if you thought really there could be three pieces, and I'd argue there's a fourth piece of maybe something that the family can engage in, you know, not unlike some of the events we have at elementary schools that celebrate families and bring families into that space. Christine, thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, Janet. And I would also say that models that I've seen have really focused the asynchronous work on the creativity component. What can I get my students to do that keeps them curious, thinking, engaged? When you try and do instruction like you might in school through these digital platforms, I think it can be very hard for students to pay attention, to engage, to experience in the same ways that you might have if you gave them more time and did an asynchronous activity. So I think in the synchronous space, it's important, like Janet said, to create those reflection pieces, that communication. How did that go for you? What did it feel like? And to create more communication in the synchronous, and the creativity and the collaboration can happen asynchronously.
I have a question here from Rosemary. Has anyone started offering support groups for children in homes with addiction, domestic violence, or any guidance? And she added that she's concerned about elementary school age children, and in addition, concerned about privacy and talking about some of these issues. And I might want to kind of reframe that question a little bit to, are there resources or strategies that we can employ when we think about support for these student populations in particular?
Christine, thoughts?
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, but there are definitely groups of very experienced people who are taking trauma-informed practices and creating ways that teachers can create those communities online and work through those practices in these remote spaces, but also offering, I think, some guidance. So I have some resources that I'll share with Manaf after this webinar that we can include in the email, but there are definitely centers who are really good at that work and who are transitioning that work into remote spaces.
Anne writes that my child can't focus on a school schedule. She has PTSD-like trauma from the emotional experiences of school closing, losing contact with teachers and classmates. This feels urgent. And I think it's a really important comment especially playing off our title. I totally agree it's urgent. I also think it's important. The words aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And if we go back to principle 1 about people have to feel safe before learning as we traditionally define it in schools takes place, I think when parents find themselves and caregivers find themselves in spaces where following a school schedule is not working, it's time to pivot. And that can be done through the help of the teacher. If there's a school social worker, some of the resources that Christine will share. Safety and security have to be in place before anything that is more of our traditional curriculum can be attended to.
Going through some of our other questions here. I'm getting one from Jennifer. We are a K-12 school. The shift has been most natural for our high school students and most challenging for our K-5 teachers. We've sent home restricted managed iPads for the K-5 students to use. However, teachers have experienced a learning curve as they shift from doing so much teaching and differentiating in person to now needing to deliver mini lessons online via Google Sites and seesawing, as well as host small group conferences, one-on-one check-ins, etc. Do you have any advice on helping them to manage the shift? And I think this kind of ties right alongside the technology integration guide. Could you all maybe walk us through an example of how to manage that better?
Sure, I can answer that. One, I think what who was the question from?
Jennifer.
What Jennifer is highlighting is what many teachers are experiencing, where there's this push to somehow push what I'm teaching into a tool, right? I'm going to use this Google site, I'm going to use these iPad devices. And I would encourage all of us to think about, first, what are my students interested in? What is the learning that I want to happen? How do I want that to happen? And then think about the tool or the experiences that I could create for my students to achieve that. I think because we have devices, we then think teaching has to be online. But Janet and I are very intentional about saying remote learning and not online learning, because I think we need to differentiate and separate the two. That I even saw someone in the chat mention that they delivered bags of materials to their students' houses and are creating experiences for those students to use those materials. I would also not negate pen and paper, just like you would use in a classroom. They can do things on pen and paper and take pictures and post them and share and give feedback. So I would encourage everyone to start with the student interest, start with your learning objectives, think about how you want to teach it, and then think about what are the tools that could elevate this, and not try and force everything into a Google site, because I think everything that Jennifer articulated is exactly what's happening, and it doesn't feel good for the student, for the teacher, or for the families at home.
I'm also seeing some great examples of, in this kind of neighborhood approaches, and I think this works particularly well at elementary. I mean, the one that's hit the news the most is kind of the teddy bear hunt, but you could also think about those sort of visible neighborhood tangible experiences from a curriculum point of view. I tend to think from a science learning opportunity. And if you're in California right now, which birds have flown by, which trees are blooming, what flowers blooming, these are things you could take pictures of, you can make graphs of, you can put something in the front window. You have to tweak it based on, am I in a really urban area where everybody's living in an apartment, or am I in a neighborhood where I can wander the streets and there's grass growing? But this mix of some things are virtual, some things are Zoom synchronous, but other things happen in our real 3D world. And again, as Christine said, we're trying to embrace the concept of remote as opposed to online.
Do you have other examples of strategies that you have been seeing that are working quite well, or perhaps strategies to put in place when we think about remote learning, especially considering the emphasis of online learning that's occurring around us, or perhaps the emphasis of online learning from folks who aren't teachers, who see that as kind of the thing to do right now, so to speak?
A lot of local examples, if you're looking for very specific examples, a lot of the museums, like I know the Tech Museum Innovation in San Jose, and I would probably check wherever you live, your local museums have put together a lot of what I would say like task cards that are activities that students can do with materials that they may have at their home. And so I would encourage teachers to really look at what museums have put out, to think about the activities like Janet highlighting around what can I use in the world around me and kind of connect back to what we're doing. I would also offer that the pressure doesn't always have to be on the teacher. I think something that has become very powerful about this moment is the authors of books, the librarians, the artists, right, are putting their work out also for students to experience. So there are ways to connect, like with Mo Willems, who does Elephant and Piggy, and to bring those into your classroom as ways for you to connect with what this experience is like for all of us, and to assess learning in different ways than we might have imagined in classrooms.
We had someone who recommended the Child Mind Institute as a great way to, a great resource for helpful trainings and student counseling approaches, kind of going back to some of our previous questions. So thank you for contributing that. I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. I got a question about distance learning for our kindergarten, first, and second graders. What are some ways to gather student work that would be good checkpoints for feedback and eventual assessment? Context, since we're not interacting face-to-face, teachers are not able to provide immediate feedback. And the best use of teachers' time while remote is not to be correcting 20 phonics worksheets, according to this question asker, but rather having a few meaningful interactions around submitted work. What are your thoughts on that? Or what are maybe some strategies to create checkpoints for feedback?
Some strategies I have seen is, how can you get students to show their thinking through a process? So if it's an end goal, what are ways that you can check in to kind of see how they're thinking about a series of steps or a task that you have given them? And I would really encourage, even in the younger grades, to encourage peer interaction. I know Flipgrid is a popular platform, but something where the students can see what they're doing and give feedback to one another is also a way to encourage that communication, to emphasize those skills. And also, like I said previously, I agree that the 20 phonics worksheets is not the best assessment, but it comes with what are the objectives that you have for these students at the end of your learning goal? What is it that you're hoping that they show you? And what are some different ways that you could offer them for them to show you their thinking and to show you their understanding of the content?
On the practical level, playing off what Christine is saying, there's hold up your work. There's write the word that was hardest for you on a sticky note and put that up for everybody to see. I wasn't 100% sure from the nature of the question, Manaf, because the person mentioned remote learning. How did the question start?
Yeah, good ways to gather student work that would be good checkpoints for feedback, given that we aren't interacting face-to-face and teachers aren't able to provide immediate feedback.
All right, because there was a part of the question I couldn't tell if they ever see their kids, because I count this as face-to-face. So if you never see your kids, if everything is being done through homework packets and whatnot, you could go old-fashioned and do things through the mail. When homework packets go home, put in stamps and envelopes. So without knowing a little bit more of the context, I have ideas, but I'm not sure. I don't want to not answer the real question that's being asked.
So I want to pick one that has been popping up in the chat from Paul. So hi, Paul, thank you for your question. I'm in a South Texas school district, secondary, that has been pushing the notion of not pressuring the students to the point that remote learning has been made easy. Example, reading an article in super easy multiple choice that I do not see as learning. Can this backfire? Nurturing the student so much at this time that it may turn them off to remote learning.
Well done, Paul. So this is a great example. If you think back to the slide we put up there with the 5 principles, it's starting in the right place, right? Let's care for our students as whole human beings. But then it's veering into what we already know is a less effective strategy, whether you're in the classroom or you're remote. Easy multiple choice, guess and pick. None of that helps with real learning. So how do you support your students and maintain some academic rigor? Because one of the things to remember is if we make it too easy for kids, and I don't mean like just make the multiple choice test harder and longer. I mean, if we lower the bar for academic rigor, that's a way of saying, I don't respect you. I don't think you can learn this. So take care of the whole student, be kind, listen, and when we're doing our academic work, raise the bar and make it worth doing. So for example, they're going to read an article. What's a meaningful way to process that article? What's a key point they're going to share with a partner in a breakout group? What's the new last paragraph they're going to write because they're going to think about an alternative ending? What's the counter article they're going to find that makes points that are opposite to that article? Raise the bar. Don't just make it about checklisty, sort of accountability, low-level accountability. You can prove to me that you looked at the article. Christine, I bet you can build on this.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I actually think in Paul's last line around, will nurturing students then turn them off to remote learning? But I actually think the type of learning you're describing is not nurturing to them. And that, like Janet said, we have to combine nurturing their emotions, but also with this idea around creativity and curiosity, what can we do to help them, one, make sense of everything that is in the now, and also become better people because of it? What are those experiences that I can provide as a teacher, synchronously or asynchronously, that can support that?
I'm seeing a question from April here, kind of going into the corner of in the intersection of technology and equity here. Many of my students cannot access synchronous content. I hesitate to do it all, to do it at all if a large amount of my students cannot access it due to parent schedules, lack of access to technology and internet, etc. It seems very inequitable. How can I create community without excluding some of my students who can't make scheduled meetings with me?
What April is highlighting is what we're seeing in a lot of schools moving to online learning. And I will say, again, we're intentional about remote learning versus online learning. And for April to center, what is it that she wants her students to learn? What are the learning objectives, and how am I going to accomplish that? I've seen some really strong examples of what we would do in classrooms of turn and talk, but teachers organizing phone calls for their students to call their partner and talk about these prompts, or working through a way for them to do asynchronous activities and for the teacher to call them, or to use the mail and mail them pen pal type of experiences. So there are definitely ways to create those communities, but I think it has to center first around what are my learning objectives for my students, and how do I want them to continue to collaborate and communicate with each other?
I also think as different parts of the country come off shelter in place, but we're still in remote learning for schools, you could think about common spaces, a community park, a central tree, where people could go and post an answer, put some data that they've collected about a question that you're sharing, and think about how to do place-based education that's less reliant on technology. The other thing I've found in some of the deeper conversations about the inequities with technology, phones seem more ubiquitous than tablets or computers, and also rely less on the Wi-Fi dependency. And so if you can think of things that are more phone friendly, even if it's a GroupMe or a text chain or something, that might be another way to mitigate some of those inequities and still build a sense of community.
All right, I have a question from a few folks that kind of relate to grading and assessment. High schools and high school districts are grappling with grading right now. Any advice that we should be mindful of as teachers managing grading practices?
So I know of two debates, so it depends where this question is. One is the whole assigning a summative grade at the end and what happens to transcripts. And then the other is, how do we assess the work? And I think that the work that goes on during, and I get they are related. Formative assessment to me is way more important in this time, and some of the questions we've been getting about how do I provide feedback and how do I make it timely, I think that's a good place for teachers to put their energy. Stanford is not doing grades this quarter. They've gone to a satisfactory, I can't remember if it's unsatisfactory or no credit. And so at high schools, one of the arguments I'm hearing is we have to do letter grades because of college. And so that's the reason I'm pointing out that here's a college that is not doing grades. This pandemic has hit everybody, not just in our country, around the world. If the number one argument at your school about why we need to do grades for a transcript is about college, you can knock that one right off the table. There's going to be so many accommodations for how we think about what the experience was the second semester of school. I cannot see that getting in the way of college admissions. And I do know that can be a parent voice that's pretty loud. Christine, you want to add on to other ideas for grading?
I think you hit on it, Janet, but I think also this time is helping us refocus what is our goal with learning. And I hope our end conclusion isn't that a student is identified and given meaning based on the letter grade that I have given them as a teacher. So what are ways that we can think of that differently to really make the student feel seen and heard and make them feel like I am worth something, I am worth more than this letter grade. And I hope that this is an opportunity for schools and districts to challenge those ideas.
I have a question here on thoughts and strategies, or do you have thoughts and strategies on how to motivate and engage students to connect to use remote learning when a district may mandate that student grades cannot be lowered because of not participating? The person who asked a question mentioned that they already had a student ask, so if I don't do anything, my grade will stay the same.
This relates to what Christine's saying. If we make school about the grades and we make it about, if you keep the focus on kind of the teacher gives you a grade, we've thwarted the purpose of schools. Schools are about learning, and teaching is about providing opportunities for learning. So if I had a student say that to me, I would put it back to the student. You're right. Mathematically, that's exactly what can happen. Is that what you want out of this experience? Or do you want something more for yourself? And how can I help you reach that goal?
I would also add, in the guide that we shared earlier, one of the things that we emphasize is this idea around connected learning. And there are some links in there for you to explore, but it's the idea around how do we understand what interests and assets our students bring to the classroom, and how can we leverage that for learning? Because I think that students do check out for lots of reasons, but if we can hook them with something that is interesting and engaging and leverages their assets, they're going to be much more willing to participate. Additionally, I think that also is because community has been built. So in Janet's first slide, I think it also depends on the community that they're in and the community that you're creating in this new space to really get students to engage and want to participate in the learning experiences.
And an interesting piece about a disruption as great as a pandemic, it lets you start over. So there's an opportunity to say to your students, you know, that way we used to do school, we're throwing all those rules out. We're going to start over. And we get to make this driven by your interests and your assets. There's a lot of freedom afforded by the fact that we're all doing school a way we've never done it before.
You mentioned that you saw a question in the chat.
The question is, do you have any thoughts about moving away from multiple choice and toward collaborative meaning making for asynchronous high school math classes? And I want to answer it right above the math class part and talk about the move away from multiple choice toward collaborative meaning making first. And then I think I want to encourage participants to add on their ideas in the chat box so you benefit from each other's learning. Because what I'm doing there is I'm also modeling a low-level way to do collaborative learning. Christine and I are not the only two people in the room that know something. In fact, I'm pretty sure of our 77 participants, people know a lot more than we do about some of these particular questions. A key for thinking about collaborative learning and socially constructing learning is to think about how does one person's idea get out and another person's idea either get added onto it or challenge it or somehow massage that first idea. When you're synchronous, we do that turn and talk, share a key idea that the two of you learn on, and so, etc. If you want to do that asynchronously, we think about documents, a Google Doc, where the first person puts a prompt and the second person builds on it. I do my math work and show my progress toward that solution. And then that gets posted in a way that other people can comment and respond to it. That obviously works better with a more complex problem than, say, a simple arithmetic. Christine, you want to build on the direction that I'm going?
Sure. Yeah, like what Janet's highlighting is there are ways that we can think about who the authentic audiences are for us to share our learning, right? So we can do that with the peers, we can do that with the teacher, we can do it with our family members at home. So there are lots of ways to figure out what is it that I want my students to voice and to share, and who is it possible that they can share that with, and how can they share that back with me? Which I think is different than how we think about it in person, because it's us in a classroom with our students. But now there is actually a larger reach of other people for them to share their knowledge with, and for them to have that conversation, which I think could actually elevate some of their learning and conversations more so than when we did it in person.
I have a question here from Kara. Do you have ideas for how to make a public product meaningful at the end of the semester? The lack of in-person learning has taken away from some of the public accountability and audience I relied on before. And Kara, if you could give us a little bit more context in terms of your school or classroom, that would be helpful. But Janet or Christine, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually think that links quite well to the point that we were just talking about, that there are a lot of authentic audiences in digital spaces. And depending on the comfort level of your students and their age, there's a lot of ways to show public product to the public. I think what's really cool about some of the things that we've been seeing in social media is a lot of the original creators of the works, the authors, the artists, the musicians, are making themselves available to classrooms and to people. So I would push us to think about, like, what is this product that I'm having my students make, and who's someone that I could reach out to share this with, or even within our local community, whether it's on Twitter or on Nextdoor or on Facebook. You know, there's some things you have to think through before you do that. But I think there are lots of ways to get some really cool, authentic audience experiences out of having remote learning.
Given that we might have intermittent school closures next year, or that we don't know when we're returning to schools, what would you advise as key steps in the summer to move from emergency remote learning to more seamless physical school distance learning back and forth?
If I got to rule the world, when we're allowed to be closer than 6 feet, we'd be having ice cream socials out in the schoolyard or the front steps, whatever your structure is, so that we'd reconnect as human beings and remember we're all in this together. Christine?
Yeah, I would say, similar to what we talked about at the beginning, I think there is an urgency now because schools closed and the next day we had to start teaching. And that is going to continue, right? And we are not having a pause unless you intentionally set that for yourself. So I think over the summer, it's really valuable to think about, how am I adding creativity, collaboration, and communication in my classroom? What are those experiences grounded in? Like Janet said, whether it's the ice cream social, and how can I bring that into my learning? Once you can establish that, how it happens, whether in person or remote, can be decided in the moment at that time. But I think if you can establish those things first, it becomes much easier to transition between in-person and remote experiences.
With that, I'd like to just wrap up with one very simple question. You've provided a number of great takeaways to remind us about centering on what's important and not what's urgent, and certainly this wonderful tool, the technology integration guide. What's the silver lining to all of this? What's the learning lesson for all of us as teachers and classroom educators? What is the glass half full experience that we can kind of take away from what we're all experiencing right now?
I think there's two pieces to it from my observations to date. One is a not so gentle reminder that there are students who live in crisis every day, not just when there's a pandemic, and we're not serving those students well. As crisis has hit all of us, we've been forced to think about the role of crisis in families' lives and what that means to us as educators. So I think increasing empathy and hopefully engaging in action based on that empathy is one silver lining. The other piece that I hope people don't lose track of, you have the opportunity in many ways to blow up the system as we know it. Many, many children and many, many families are not being served well by school the way we do it. We don't have to continue those inequities. This is our time.
I kind of don't want to comment because that was so brilliant, but I feel like whatever I say will be, so we'll pretend, we'll change the recording so Janet's after mine. But I agree with Janet with all of those points, and that if anything, this has shown us, for better or for worse, that you need to know your students and you need to know the communities in which they live and the communities that you serve. And at the end, we're all just humans, teaching humans about being humans. And if that's not our real focus in learning, then I'm not sure why we're here. So I agree that it's a chance to blow it up, and I hope only for the good.